Test it. Hello. Yeah, for sure. I'm no rush.
Yeah, but in politics, that was so much easier. You guys can just come over whatever. It's fine. We gotta do our hair, our makeup, everything.
So what have you been doing since high school?
There was a stint in my life where I was a homeless alcoholic for a bit, and once I finally pulled myself out of that, I was like, the reason why that happened was I was a survivor of domestic abuse, and after I pulled myself out of that, I met my husband, and the minute I saw him, I didn't even meet him. I didn't even know his name. I was walking with my supervisor onto the casino floor at South Beach. I was like, I'm gonna marry that guy, and he looked at me like I was the craziest person ever. He's like, oh my god, like this chick's nuts, right? And sure enough, I ended up getting married to him, and I've been at home with my kids ever since then. I can't afford to go to university because I'm on status.
Yep.
And so I've been self-teaching myself politics for the last 3.5 years.
Good evening, everyone. We'll be starting in a few minutes.
How's campaigning going for you? You've got one of the hardest ridings in the country there.
It's very large, but I'm loving every minute of it because it's so diverse, right? Like you see all types of different people up there, and I feel like I'm in my element because I live on reserve, right? So when I'm in other reserves, it feels like I'm home.
Okay.
So I find that I have a bit more of an advantage.
Where's
there.
home for you?
Little Black River.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. Yeah. No, that is interesting. I wanted to think how many, there are 5 indigenous languages there.
Cree is the primary one. Yeah.
And then, I think, how do you say it? OG Cree, there's a better way to say it.
Ojibwe?
Anishawabeg? Because OG Cree can mean fly. I mean, a few of my OG Cree friends were teaching me, and I'm not saying it right, so I'll go with OG
Yeah.
Cree just because that's
So-
what I can. And then you'd have some Dene even.
Yeah. So where I am, it's Ojibwe, and I am Plains Cree, but I've been informally adopted by the Ojibwe. So I go to ceremonies. I don't go to church. I go to ceremonies, and that is my church. And I'm learning Ojibwe teachings there. And while I'm there, I'm also learning to speak the Ojibwe language. But my grandparents-in-law are fluent in Ojibwe, so there's a lot of broken English, so it's easier to learn how to speak it. But yeah, I should probably learn how to speak some Cree since I am. But
For example, how do you say hello in Cree?
in Cree. I can say certain words in Ojibwe. Like when I greet people, it's always amin, amin.
Tanse, Anin Buju, Red Skyman Dijnakash, Obuskeyang Ninduji. My name is Ryan Beardy, and I will be your MC for this evening. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we're on Treaty 1 territory and the traditional homelands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Dene, Ojibwe, and Dakota nations. On behalf of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, I would like to send a warm welcome to everyone who is gathered here today. I would like to begin this evening by inviting Dennis Whitebird to begin this evening in a good way with a prayer.
Thank you very much for the welcome. First of all, I want to welcome you all to this gathering to hear what our candidates have to offer to us as Indigenous peoples. And we have heard now that we are in the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabeg, Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples. And we have documented history that places us in this territory anywhere from 4,000 to 10,000 years. So we're very proud of that, and it became later as Treaty 1 territory, much later. With that, I want to say in my own language, I want to communicate to the Creator to look down upon us and give us strength, happiness, and wellness as we hold this discussion with our candidates today. I'm Gjemandu. I'm Sawa Semagat Hunak. I'm Sawa Geb Miabajak Nomi Pikaganunan. The ske whip me Bagushtuani Gjewatsun. Jiminashki Namot the Gdanshinabem say gab me ayat. I'm the Swim the Gamanogum. Matska Mamuinohang. With a Mangdosogo. Needs Nishnave, needs of Madsiminan. Gavin Odash, Adagasnamishanam, Koikchagagi Tuang, Koikchagagi Tuang. The sketch of Metewa Tuang Yagab mentioned among Nogum. The snag the Maganoshnam Gemandu, Mishanam, Gigawatsuin, Minoyawin. The scale where Samagam that comes to me on of Memata Mi Magab Minagonandas, Gigawatsuin Gemandu. Mimics gave me a Kaduan Nogum, Agin and Akamin. The smell been home, the Monjagan of Bianc, away. Oh. Okay, I've asked in my prayer, I prayed on behalf of this tobacco, and I also prayed that we would share this tobacco with the candidates. And part of our teaching is that when we hold tobacco, such as we do here, is for strength and also honesty, so that our candidates can speak the truth and be truthful. Miigwech.
I'd like to thank Dennis Whitebird for starting our evening in a good way. Let's give him a round of applause. I would now like to invite Sioux Arrows Drum Group from Chinupuaka to offer a traditional song. Who? Let's give him a round of applause, guys. Beautiful song. Thank you, Sue Arrows, for that beautiful song. I want to acknowledge the political party representatives who took the time to be a part of this event. I want to thank everyone who gathered here to show their support as well. Miigwech. I want to remind everybody that this event is going to be live streamed on the AMC Facebook page. Before proceeding, I would like to read a disclaimer. Photographs and film footage may be taken during this event, which may or may not include your recognizable image or a video. By participating in this event, you consent to being photographed or filmed and authorize the organizer to use the photographs or film in print, digital, video, or web-based format for its promotional or archival use. For further information, contact AMC by email at athunder@manitobachiefs.com. I'd like to ask the viewers out there to please take a moment to share the live feed with your contacts so that we could spread this reach across Canada. Please also note that I'm First Nations and I Vote t-shirts will be available in the back. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs would like to recognize Indigenous candidates in the federal election. Today, we're inviting Kathy Doyle to come speak as an independent. Kathy Doyle was born in Manitowoc, Manitoba, is a member of Little Black River First Nation and the Sturgeon Clan. Her spirit name is Miskwa Mishikikwa, Red Turtle Woman, and she is a traditional women's power dancer who participates in various Anishinaabe spiritual ceremonies. She is running in Winnipeg North as an independent candidate. Kathy completed an honors thesis, bachelor honors 4-year degree at the University of Winnipeg, and a master's on Indigenous women's health and wellness at Athabasca University. She has also completed part of a doctoral degree at the University of Manitoba, where she explored factors that contribute to the conception of Indigenous peoples' identities. In addition to these qualifications, she has been a research associate with the Prairie Women's Health Center of Excellence in the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg, and has conducted many community research projects for the Prairie Women's Health Center of Excellence, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry's Child Welfare Initiative, the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, the Center of Excellence for Child Welfare, the Native Women's Association of Canada, and the Government of Manitoba's Health Child Office. She is also a past member of the Canadian Indigenous and Native Studies Association, Canadian Mental Health Association, Aboriginal Council of Winnipeg Incorporated, and mother of Red Nations Women's Council Incorporated, and was vice president of the Elizabeth Fry Society of Manitoba, board member for the Aboriginal Senior Resource Center of Winnipeg. She has been employed as a tutor and subject matter expert for Athabasca University for over 10 years in areas of Indigenous women's health, Indigenous governance, and Indigenous resistance. She has also taught courses in the departments of psychology, human ecology, and the Aboriginal Focus Program at the University of Manitoba, the Indigenous Studies and Masters in Development Practice, Indigenous Development at the University of Winnipeg, and in the CFS Diploma Program at Yellow Kid College. Kathy lives in the city of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and has 2 grown daughters, 4 grandchildren, 2 grand dogs, 1 grand cat, and 1 grand bird named Maya. Kathy?
Miigwech, Mr. Beatty, for that warm welcome. Hello, everyone. I am so pleased to be here tonight. As was said in the introduction, my name is Kathy Guimau Doyle, and I'm from Little Black River First Nation, but I've resided here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and for a period also in Southern Ontario many years ago now. But it is my pleasure to offer my services to the community of Winnipeg North as an independent candidate for the upcoming federal elections. The reason I chose to run as an independent candidate was because I feel with an independent voice, I won't be as encumbered to represent you and the other communities of Winnipeg North as I would be if I ran with one of the major parties. An example of the kind of trouble you can get into by being a member of, like Dan Vendel is a member of the Liberals, James Badon is a member of the Greens, Kyle Mason is a member of the NDP, And my fellow Black River member, Syra, is conservative. And traditionally, in Indigenous communities, we are adverse to the Conservatives, with perhaps good reason, but I'm so proud of my fellow Black River First Nation member to stand up with the Conservatives. But one of the strong points about running as an independent candidate is I'm able to better represent your needs without letting party politics trip me up. We saw what happened with Jody Wilson-Raybould, who ran for the Liberals. The minute she disagreed with her party, she was ousted. This could happen to any of these candidates. Believe it, they are towing a party line. And that party line relates directly to the majority population in Canada, in Winnipeg. That majority population is primarily Western European. So all of the structures, all of the systems are made to support the status quo, which is not us. Hence events like this. I'm First Nations and I vote. Well, if we are to look at the Manitoba election results as any indication of how motivated we are as First Nation people to vote, then it's a very sad story, because we have no motivation to vote. Why? Because of these four major parties. They do not represent us adequately enough. That's not to say they don't try, but they're at first base, let's say, in a ball game. Whereas I'm in a position as an independent to hit a home run for everyone. So if I'm elected, I've written a few notes here. If I can pull this down, stretch so much. A few notes down of some of my platform issues and some of my platform promises, so to speak. If I am elected, I will be working on pressuring the federal government to honor the treaties and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, because they have failed us in that category. They have failed us in all categories if our socioeconomic status is the measure. There's many other measures of our well-being, but if our social economic status is a measure, these four parties have failed us miserably. That is why I'm honored to run as an independent for people of Winnipeg North. If I'm elected, I'll be pressuring the federal government to stop stealing our children and to obey their legal obligations, like providing equitable funds to First Nations children and families. That's perhaps one of our biggest issues. And there's a court order currently on the Liberal federal government of Canada to give us equitable funding for our First Nation. There have been how many contestations against the federal government for not obeying the law, for not obeying the court rule. Perhaps Dan Vendel can speak to that when his turn comes to speak to about the feds, or the Liberals. If I am elected in Winnipeg North, I will be pressuring the federal government to give us a fair chance to participate in the social and economic arenas in Canada, because we have not had that opportunity. It's amazing that some of us do so well, and many of us do. I see the precious youth, the young people, they are doing well within the restraints that the federal government of Canada has placed on us. If I am elected, I will do everything in my power to break down the hegemonic systems that have kept us oppressed for so long, for too long. For one thing, and this is just one of my platform promises, for one thing, if I'm elected, I will be promoting First Nation sales tax rebates and or the total elimination of sale tax for First Nations people. In Ontario, we've all enjoyed that break, right? We can go to Ontario, present our treaty card, and we don't pay sales tax. Why should we be any different here in Manitoba? Well, yes, the laws, as First Nation people, the federal government has a fiduciary responsibility to us, and they do not follow through on that. That responsibility reneges all provincial laws and regulations. We should not be paying a sales tax in Manitoba. If I'm elected, I will fight for that. None of your other parties here have ever done that. Because why? Because they don't care. They're toeing the party line. They're protecting the majority populations in Canada. And that has got to stop. Someone needs to speak to our, someone needs to speak to our needs at the federal level in a more profound manner than is currently being offered by other MPs. And by any means, I'm not negating the valuable work like Dan Vandel is precious. And when gloves are off in elections, gloves are off, what can I say? But that doesn't mean I don't value his valuable work. Most people who know me know I fit nicely into the Liberal mold. However, I do not, and I normally support Liberal policies. But I don't fit into that mold completely because I'm Indigenous and I vote. So someone needs to speak to our needs in a more profound way than the current MPs do. Because of our special and unique relationship with the federal crown, we should be reimbursed all PST contributions that we have made immediately. Like we get GST rebates, I'm going to fight so we get PST rebates. And or we don't pay sales tax here in Manitoba at all, in Winnipeg North. And that might be one question that you want to ask my fellow candidates. It may seem like a hard, impossible row, but here in Manitoba, we've had court cases where the provincial law has been undermined, is undermined by our treaty status in the Constitution. So ask these candidates why they're not fighting for our rights, because they're not. So my suggestion right now to close off is start saving your receipts. Because if I am elected, I will be pushing hard for the Indigenous right not to pay sales tax on Turtle Island. Our ancestors paid heavily for our taxes with their lives. Isn't that enough? If I am elected, I will stand beside all my Indigenous brothers and sisters, regardless of party affiliation, for what is rightfully ours. Hi, miigwech.
We'll open questions later. We're going to have a Q&A portion after the federal candidates. Thank you, Kathy. On behalf of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, now we would like to move into the main focus of the evening, the panel discussion with our federal party candidates. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs sent an invitation to the leaders of the Liberal, Conservative, NDP, and Green parties. Instead of attending tonight's event, each of them sent a representative to speak on behalf of the party. The focus of tonight's panel is to discuss issues of national importance. Each party has been approved to respond to questions on behalf of their party, each party representative. I want to ask those watching online to quickly take a moment to reshare the slide feed again. So I'll introduce the candidates. Representing the Liberal Party of Canada, we have Dan Vandel. Dan Vendel is a member of Parliament for St. Boniface, St. Vital, elected in 2015. Prior to his election as MP for St. Boniface, St. Vital in 2015, Dan Vandel served 5 terms as Winnipeg City Councillor for St. Boniface. He is especially proud for his role in the development of Winnipeg's Aboriginal Youth Strategy, the first of its kind in Canada. As a social worker, he worked at Winnipeg's Mamawai Ichitata Center from 2010 to 2013. He was chair of the board of directors for the Aboriginal People Television Network. In 2013, he led the board through a CRTC license renewal process, culminating in a 5-year network renewal. Since 2018, Dan has been Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. Representing the Conservative Party of Canada, we have Sierra Bird. Sierra is a 22-year-old wife and mother of 2 daughters. She lives in Little Black River First Nation. Her spirit name in English is Echoing Thunderbird Woman. Sierra is running with the Conservative Party for the federal riding of Churchill-Kiwatanook-Eski. Sierra's community is located at the bottom of the riding, and her riding goes all the way to the Churchill geographically. It is the 5th largest riding in Canada and has one of the highest percentage of First Nations people. Sierra was raised by a single mother in rural Manitoba. At a very young age, she took an interest in politics. But not being able to afford post-secondary education, she was left with no other option than to become self-taught. Sierra made a goal in 2013 to run in the federal election of 2023, but decided to run for federal office this spring because our people cannot wait any longer for an effective voice. Sierra has struggled with mental health illness such as depression and anxiety. There was a period of time where she battled with alcohol addiction and was homeless. Sierra does not see her past as a disadvantage, but rather an advantage because it has made her more compassionate and understanding. Sierra is working to reclaim her culture. She has been attending ceremonies with her husband since 2016. Her children have been attending the lodge since they were born. That's Sierra. Representing Canada's New Democratic Party, we have Kyle Mason. Kyle is a member of Peguis First Nation and lives in Winnipeg North. He grew up in the riding in a single-parent family. He faced the challenges that many Canadians face in an inner-city environment. Determined to succeed in life, Kyle avoided unhealthy life options, went to college, and has dedicated his career to social justice works, and helping thousands of Winnipeg North families get out of poverty. In the fall of 2008, Kyle founded and launched the North End Family Center, a Winnipeg North nonprofit organization that offers social programs, a place of community, and empowered families to escape poverty. Under his 9 years of leadership, the organization served an average of 1,100 community members per month. Until recently, Kyle was the chair of the North End Renewal Corporation. He is also a member of the St. John's Park Healing Forest and Gonzaga Middle School. He is a former member of the Boldness Project's Community Leadership Guide Group. He was also a founding member of the Winnipeg Police Board's Indigenous Council on Policing and Crime Prevention and World Vision Canada's National Advisory Council for Canadian Programs. In 2013, Kyle received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. In 2015, Kyle was chosen as a CBC Manitoba Future 40 leader, which highlighted leaders from different sectors who are making a difference within Manitoba. In the summer of 2017, Kyle was awarded a Community Hero Award by the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Kyle was also selected to participate in the prestigious 2017 Governor General Canadian Leadership Conference. That's Kyle. And representing the Green Party, we have James Bedham. You may remember James from our last town hall. At that time, he was representing the Green Party of Manitoba. Today, he is representing the Green Party of Canada. In 2018, James was elected as leader of the Green Party of Manitoba. From 2008 to 2013, James balanced his Green Party leadership duties with part-time law studies and part-time employment as an environmental research consultant. James was called to the Bar of Manitoba in 2014, and in October 2017, he and Seneca Longclaws founded the firm Bedham and Longclaws Law Corporation. James' legal practice focuses on serving First Nations governments, tribal organizations, and individuals with legal matters pertaining to Indigenous law, environmental law, and civil litigation. James has handled matters before the Clean Energy Commission, the National Energy Board, the independent assessment process established as part of the Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, the Manitoba Queen's Bench, the Federal Court of Canada, and the Federal Court of Appeal. Let's give a round of applause for James. On behalf of the Manitoba, Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, I want to thank you all for coming out. Let's give another round of applause for all the candidates, guys. Thank you. Second. I would like to draw the attention to the timer in front for the federal party candidates. Please keep in mind to be in line with your time. If you are not, I will kindly ask you to cut it short. Sorry. For this portion of the evening, we will be providing each candidate with 3 minutes to respond to this question. Why should First Nation voters support your party? Let's jump right in. Dan Vandel, in 3 minutes or less, why should First Nations voters support your party?
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here this evening, and let me get right at it because 3 minutes is not very long. I am very proud of the accomplishments and the partnerships that we have created with First Nations across Canada, with Indigenous nations across Canada, but tonight we'll focus on First Nations, and it begins by actually putting money in the budget to invest. Since we were elected in 2015, we have invested close to $23 billion of new money in 5 key priority areas: in infrastructure, in education, in health, in child and family services, and in creating a new fiscal relationship with First Nations across the country. Relative to child and family services, we have doubled the amount of money that we are investing in CFS since 2016, from $600 million to $1.2 billion just in child and family services. A great example of our investment in infrastructure is that since being elected in 2015, we have removed 87 long-term drinking water boil advisories from reserves across Canada. There are 56 left, and we are committed to removing all of them by March 2021. The money is in the budget. We have the administration ready to administer, and the contractors who are ready to actually get it done. 87 long-term boil water advisories removed since 2015. Put that in context, 10 years of Stephen Harper, they removed none. That's very impressive. We've introduced new legislation on Indigenous child welfare, which actually recognizes the inherent right for First Nations to take care of their own children and to set their own laws governing child welfare. We've introduced legislation on Indigenous languages, which became the law of the land before we broke for this election. We've actually put together and implemented a national inquiry on missing and murdered women and girls in this country. This is after Stephen Harper said on numerous occasions this was simply not a priority for him and his government. We got it done 6 months after getting elected. Right now in the House of Commons, we have simultaneous translation for Indigenous languages, thanks to the work of Robert Falcon-Willett, who's in the audience, MP from Winnipeg Centre, current MP and future MP for Winnipeg Centre. And we're going to continue the investments. We have the plan. We want to get rid of all drinking water advisories by March. We want to continue investing in education, in health, and in child and family. I'm 6 seconds before my limit.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
A round of applause for Dan. And we'll move on. Sierra Bird, why should First Nations voters support your party?
So first of all, I want to say miigwech to the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs for inviting me here today. It is an honor to be here representing my party. I also want to recognize and thank Dan Vandel, Kyle Mason, and James Bedome for being here today. As a young Indigenous woman, I understand the issues that Indigenous people across Manitoba face. You know, the issues that we face across Canada. We face these issues every day, issues that should be a concern for all Canadians. I am running as the Conservative candidate in Churchill, Kootenay-Gaski because I am passionate about the issues facing Northern Manitobas and Indigenous Canadians. As I said earlier, I live in Black River First Nation with my husband and 2 children. I was raised in rural Manitoba and from a very young age learned the value of integrity and hard work. I have been knocking on doors in Churchill and the rest of the riding as well, and one thing has remained clear: life has gotten more expensive under Justin Trudeau. 2/3 of Canadians feel that they either can't pay their bills or they feel like they have nothing left over at the end of the month after they do pay their bills. I am one of those Canadians. Indigenous people both on and off reserve face far too many bureaucratic, regulatory and legislative barriers to economic development that other Canadians simply don't face. The current Liberal government has added to these problems by failing to take any steps to create sustainable economic opportunities for Indigenous people, and by failing to consult with First Nations before cancelling or blocking major projects in which they have financial interest. The Conservative Party supports the reconciliation process with Indigenous people, but there can be no true and lasting reconciliation without economic reconciliation. The government must act to empower Indigenous communities to share in the wealth that Canada is so capable of creating. We need to come up with new solutions for economic reconciliation, but we must do this together. Politicians need to listen and learn from Indigenous leaders on what works and what the federal government can do better. The promise of reconciliation is the promise to truly share in all of the opportunity and prosperity that Canada has to offer. Conservatives are focused on bringing forward policies that make real and measurable improvements in the lives of Canada's Indigenous peoples. However, as Andrew Scheer told the Special Chiefs Assembly before Christmas, the Conservative Party recognizes that sometimes in the haste to move the ball forward, we lose sight of the fact that it is just as important to advance our relationship with Indigenous people as it is to develop policies that will make a real impact in the lives of Indigenous Canadians. We want to do better. Significant gaps remain, and Canadians don't accept that. We need to work together to lift First Nations out of poverty and into prosperity, where a bright future is within grasp of every single child in this country. A Conservative government led by Andrew Scheer will support effective investments in important areas such as access to housing, health services, and good quality drinking water. But we will also be an enthusiastic partner to those communities who are trying to find their way through bureaucratic roadblocks to build prosperity in their communities. It is critical that government spending translates into meaningful results on the ground. Conservatives want to work with First Nations to create a positive future for Indigenous youth, and I hope to be part of building that future.
Thank you, Sierra. We'll move on to Kyle Mason. Kyle, why should First Nations voters support your party?
Aneng bonjour, Tanse, hello everybody. First, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the drum and the drummers that were here this evening, especially the young man who was at the drum. It's very important to see that our youth are being trained up in our ways and they can take their spots in due time. Also want to acknowledge the elders, and I want to thank the elder for his prayer this evening, and thank you everybody for the tobacco. Also want to acknowledge any chiefs that might be here in the room this evening and leaders. Also want to acknowledge the women and the youth as well, as you are play vital roles within our community. Also want to say greetings to my fellow candidates this evening. And as you heard in my bio at the beginning, I am a member of Peguis First Nation. I'm actually the direct descendant of Peguis himself, and my great-great-grandfather was the signatory to Treaty 1. My mother's side, I am Métis, and actually my grandparents were co-founders of the Manitoba Métis Federation. But however, I grew up in the north end of Winnipeg with my single mother. We struggled to make ends meet, and times were often difficult. However, after high school, I spent my time building a career of nearly 20 years now, helping fellow people within Winnipeg North and beyond. Primarily best known for being the founder and director of a place called the North End Family Center. And I would encourage everybody to really give a good look at the NDP party, because we are the only party that really has a true vision for the entirety of Canada and that can understand fellow Indigenous peoples. We have one of the most diverse list of candidates nationally. Our leader, Jagmeet Singh, also a person of color, can understand what it means to be treated differently and poorly, sometimes just for being a different shade of color, and also worshiping the way that he worships. I know myself, I have experienced that time and time again. And lastly, I decided to run for the NDP, and I asked that you look at the NDP platform, because Throughout Canadian history, this country has been governed and controlled either by the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party, most of the time by the Liberal Party. These two parties are the parties of the Indian Act, residential school systems, the 60 Scoop, present-day CFS, and many other things that I can't list here right now. And just because the current Prime Minister is good-looking and has nice hair doesn't mean that we can forget all these things and just turn a new leaf. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. Last but not least, we have James Bedham. James, why should First Nations voters support your party?
Sure. Well, firstly, I just want to thank Mr. Beardy for emceeing tonight, the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs for hosting, Elder Whitebird for the tobacco and the prayer, and also the Chanawapa Drummers Circle for their beautiful songs. I really appreciated it. I think ultimately, when it comes to the Green Party, I sometimes describe the Green Party as focusing on repairing a number of relationships. Our relationship between ourselves and the planet, our relationship in community and between each other and the growing poverty and inequity that we see. And I think particularly important here, obviously, is our relationship with our Indigenous people here in Canada. And the Green Party is wholeheartedly and sincerely committed to working towards reconciliation. And that starts with, firstly, I think we're the only party that repudiates the entire doctrine of discovery and terra nullius and all their doctrines of superiority. That's unfortunately the philosophical basis that the settler population, for which I will wholeheartedly admit I am part of, has used to implement a systematic genocide on Canada's Indigenous people. And it deprives this country of great opportunity for both. I think it's important that I'm up here as the settler because guess what? The work needs to be done by the settler population in Canada. It's, Indigenous people have, despite terrible historical conditions, have nonetheless continued to be resilient. I want to acknowledge Ms. Dowd made that point and acknowledge my other candidates that are here. I also want to quickly acknowledge at the back my neighboring candidates, Winnipeg South, Paul Battesse, if you can give a quick wave to them, Paul. And in Winnipeg Centre at the front here, Andrea Chalet as well, so my other candidates here. Now, the Green Party has put out our platform today, and there's a number of pieces in here. I'm probably not going to be able to get to all of them in 1 minute, but one of the things when we're looking at self-government agreements and working with First Nations, we need to get rid of the extinguishment of Aboriginal and treaty rights as part of the negotiation aspect of self-government. Once again, it comes down to recognizing those inherent rights. Another important aspect I think that we would look at is we would work with First Nations, in partnership with First Nations, we would get rid of the Indian Act because quite frankly, it's a colonial and racist piece of legislation that needs to go. So we'd set a target of 10 years and would work with First Nations to achieve that. We are committed to implementing the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the calls to actions of the Missing and Murdered and Indigenous Women's and Girls Inquiry. I only have 17 seconds left, but we want to invest in, rather than building oil pipelines and bitumen pipelines, we would bring running water to the First Nations that require it. I hope I hear your questions later on, but I can see I'm running out of time on the clock. So thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Now we would like to move into the Q&A portion of the evening. This is an opportunity to ask the party representatives how their party will respond to First Nations concerns if elected. You're reminded that they have been approved to answer issues of national importance. The microphone in the center aisle will be used as a cue for taking questions. So if you line up there, if you have a question. If you are elderly or have disability or accessibility issues, you can raise your hand and somebody will come to you with a microphone. Questions will be asked in the order of the queue behind the microphone. Please indicate if your question is for a specific party. For the question directed to Kathy, that is allowed, absolutely. And Kathy, if you're asked a question, you're welcome to come to the podium. For those watching online, we will also be taking questions from the comments in the live feed. However, priority will be to respond to those who are on the microphone. Party representatives, I would like to direct your attention to the timer on the right. Please respect this time limit in order for us to be able to respond to as many questions as possible. Once a question is given, unless it is directed to a specific party, I will look for a raise of hands, and you will be able to answer in that order. Once again, please respect the time limit, as I will be cutting you short if need be. The floor is now open for questions.
Hi, do you want our names first or anything?
Sure, yeah, introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Vicky Poirier, and I'd like to ask the three on my left, what will you do to help reinstate the Transparency Act that the Liberal government canceled? Because right now, I feel myself, my people, First Nations people, and all of Canada that deserves to know where the money's going. We need like an audit party or something, because right now the government gives a ton of money to the chiefs and they don't have to say where it's going. That doesn't seem right to me. How can we fix this? It was fine, but the Transparency Act got canceled. Sorry, Dan.
All right, I'll go if you guys have nothing to say. This is something that from the beginning of my campaign start that I have been committed to reinstating. I feel that this is very important because we're getting money to our reserves and resources are not being built. And some chief and council are very open with where that money is going and some aren't. And I believe that if we have that legislation back in place, that we can see where this money is going, that way no questions have to be asked.
You can continue this way.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for your question. It's obviously a very important thing because as Canadians and as Indigenous peoples, we want to make sure that the money is being spent correctly and focus on our peoples. And all I'll say to the matter is that I know as the NDP, we are committed to working with First Nations and our leaders. And I know that First Nation leaders, chiefs and councils, always and largely have the best interests of their peoples. And the system itself is not always rigged in our favor. And it can be very difficult sometimes to make sure that the money that is allocated to our communities is spent the way it's spent. But I know for our party, we are absolutely committed to making sure the money is being spent the way it should be, and that is always for the betterment of our peoples.
Good, James.
So I think we need to back up and take it to a sovereignty and a self-government perspective and recognize that First Nations are the original governments of this land. And so ultimately, I think the answer is allowing more self-government, certainly First Nations among themselves. And I think we need to be careful about applying a pan-indigeneity to this, should be coming up with their own structures. I mean, this is somewhat of a legacy of imposing a democratic and a colonial structure on First Nations. I also want to highlight that's money that's owed to First Nations. I heard some of my fellow Canadians say that Canada's money. No, that's money that we owe. We owe under treaty. We owe a lot more than that. So definitely we need transparency, but I think it's actually supporting First Nation governments as governments. That's one of the reasons why we want to follow the model of Australia and actually expand on it and create a council of governments in Canada. So that would be bringing federal, provincial, municipal, and First Nation governments all to the table to try to achieve policy coherence. Certainly, I don't think anyone's going to argue that transparency is needed, but once again, I think it has to be led from the communities themselves. Otherwise, we're failing to recognize sovereignty, and we're repeating some of the same mistakes of the past. So that's how I look at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan has requested to respond to the question as well.
Yes, in my opinion, the Transparency Act is a paternalistic piece of legislation that is directly contrary to self-government and self-determination. We are working very closely with all First Nations to making sure that accountability is the cornerstone, and we are actually working on new 10-year financial arrangements where we are working cooperatively with First Nations to implement self-determination, self-government, and treat First Nations as actual levels of government as nations, just like the like we are as government. So we're working cooperatively. We're getting very good results, and I was very happy that we got rid of the Transparency Act.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Yeah, you could.
I would like to just say one thing about the Transparency Act, if you don't mind.
Yeah, you can come up.
Oh, you can't.
Or you could go to microphone. Yeah, it's quicker.
You know, I'm always amazed when that topic of transparency comes up, because I think what it does is it supports this colonial gaze that Canada has, Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians have about us. Anytime I talk with a not anytime, but quite often when I talk with a non-Indigenous person, all they say is our chiefs are corrupt, they're not being transparent. I have been working in the community for 20 years. We have honorable chiefs. We have to start trusting them. And with moving towards self-government, we have to be even more trusting. And we cannot fall into that colonial gaze where we're condemning our chiefs and our leaders. This is why my slogan is driving change independently together. So often I think we're wrongly and inadequately depicted in the mainstream. We know that. So here, in an educational town hall forum like this, I think it's vitally important to break through that colonial gaze and look at things how they are. If someone could step up, any of these candidates that are pushing for more transparency, if they can stand up and give me more than anecdotal evidence about all this corruption, then I'll listen. Until then, no, I'm not listening to false stereotypes and a critique of our very proud and honorable chiefs. Let me quit.
Thank you. We got another question?
Yeah, this is a question for all the candidates, including the independent candidate. My big gut concern these days, given what events have transpired, is I want to ask the candidates, what can you do for Indigenous peoples who are living off the land and whose food source is threatened due to mega projects, whether they be hydroelectric dams, natural gas, in Lyle Island, mining for silica sand in eastern Manitoba, used for fracking, hollow water, the latest hydroelectric dam, Labrador, that is going to make, has poisoned an entire river ecosystem, and levels of methyl mercury is now going to poison the Innu and Inuit food source. Countless more examples. Those are just some recent ones that have made themselves known to me. Obviously, assimilation and genocide, by the definition of the United Nations, killing or poisoning or destroying a food source of a people, genocide and assimilation is alive and well. And I feel like sort of directing this to the candidates except for the Liberal and the Conservatives, because the Conservatives rewrote legislation so that their energy minister could greenlight any mega project regardless of like bypassing consultation with Aboriginal peoples, bypassing environmental reviews. And the New Deal that Trudeau promised, new relationship toward Aboriginal peoples, has fallen short. But I know you have lots on your plate, but can you say what you as members of Parliament could do with regard to Indigenous peoples who are living off the land and fighting mega projects?
We will start with Dan and move right, and as well give Kathy time. We'll put 3 minutes on the clock.
There's a new way of doing things in Canada today, where in the past, development companies, resource development companies would just go in and essentially do what they wanted. Under Stephen Harper for 10 years, the Conservative government rewrote environmental laws to take away the power for environmental oversight, for consultations, for generally just weakened environmental laws in so many ways that we would be here all night talking about it. What we've tried to do is actually sit down with Indigenous nations, Métis, First Nation, and Inuit, and actually consult before projects go forward. That consultation is never easy. It's, I think people perhaps don't have an appreciation of the diversity within Indigenous nations across Canada. So if the end outcome is supposed to be a consensus on a particular project, whether it's good or bad, if there's environmental negative effects, then for sure, then it cannot go forward. But people, Indigenous people, First Nation people, have to be involved from the beginning. And that's the way we've tried to approach environment or resource development projects going forward. Of course, there's decisions that the nations themselves have the legal recourse if they feel they're not being properly consulted, and that has been exercised several times. But I think the key consideration is doing the work at the front end to making sure that we can try to build consensus and make sure that any negative and certainly any environmental destructiveness is mitigated, and if it's not, then the project is not moving forward. We've also committed to a relationship with Indigenous nations on a recognition and implementation of inherent and treaty rights. We have close to 80 nation-to-nation tables now with different nations across Canada, sitting with ministers and the Prime Minister to talk about the plans going forward and what the agreements will be going forward. It's hard work, but it needs to be done at the onset if you want to move forward on projects.
Explain Muskrat Falls when the river has been relegated to mercury poisoning. That's a food source of two Inuit nations and an Innu nation. And there's no going back from that. And if they go for their traditional food source now, they'll be poisoned with mercury, which causes birth defects, neurological defects. How do you explain that when you say the new relationship about consulting Aboriginal peoples prior to the infrastructure? How do you, the button was pushed on
I'm going to ask you to speak into the microphone. If you're gonna, can you speak into the microphone?
Just give her the microphone.
last week. How do you explain, how did that happen? How did that get by your government?
Asking about Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland.
Okay, the button, you said something about the button last week. I'm sorry, I didn't get everything that you said.
I'll give Dan one more
The button
minute.
was pushed on that dam. The water flowed, flooding the area, which now the river is poisoned with mercury. It's poisonous levels of mercury. That's their food source. How did that get by your government?
We'll give Dan one more minute to respond, and we got to move on to the other candidates. I'm sorry.
Certainly, I don't have all the information on Muskrat Falls with me this evening. I can commit to get back to you if there is environmental, if there's problems environmentally that should not go forward, and they should be remediated. Certainly, I'm 100% with you on that. I just don't have all the historic on Muskrat Falls, but I will get back to you.
Could the other candidates answer as to what could be done for other people living off land who are facing destruction of their food source?
Okay, ma'am, we start with Dan. We're gonna go right, and I'll just ask you not to have a back and forth. We'll let the party candidates answer the question first. Thank you. Go ahead, James.
Well, thank you very much for your question. It's a really important and really powerful one, and recognizes that First Nations have often paid the brunt of the price of resource developments when it's Indigenous resources originally. One of the things we can do, and what we absolutely need to do, is hand more lands over to First Nation control so that the First Nations can manage it. I think that goes without saying, and it's something that we clearly need to do. And it's worth recognizing because those rights to live off the land are inherent rights that are recognized and affirmed by the Royal Proclamation and our Constitution in Canada. The other things we need to look at is we need to move beyond duty to consult. We need to fully implement UNDRIP, and we need to move to a consent model, not just simply a duty to consult model. And beyond that, I think we also, when projects move ahead with community approval, we need to look at resource sharing, which is something that we haven't done to make sure that First Nations see benefits of projects that impact them. I mean, I'm sure our independent and even our conservative candidate, who I know are both from Little Black River First Nation, can talk about hydro impacts, as can many of the northern Manitoba First Nations, and you mentioned Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland, so thank you for that. And of course, we have a history of mining and development. So it's, I think we need to move our society away from those sort of resource extractive projects that we've done historically and move more towards a sustainable economy. And I think a sustainable economy is one that's going to work in partner with First Nations managing land, creating economic opportunities in ecotourism and other opportunities. So I thank you so much for your question. I know I think they're giving me a full 3 minutes, but I'm not sure. But I want to respect that's within 2 minutes, because I know a lot of people will have a lot of questions tonight. But I think your question was right on and hits at the heart of so many issues that I can't get into at all.
Thank you, James. We'll move on to Kyle.
Yeah, I want to thank you for your question, because obviously it's something that's very, very important to you and many tens of thousands of other Indigenous peoples across this country. And I don't know the particulars of that particular community, but I know time and time again, the government of Canada, doesn't matter which party has been in power, has not always respected our Indigenous rights in our treaties and the fact that we are the original peoples of this land. And they will, to a point, until it impacts your bottom lines or it gets in the ways of their friends in the large corporations. I know here in the NDP that we respect Indigenous rights, and we want people to be able to eat locally as much as possible in our traditional foods as well, because the lack thereof has caused a lot of health issues within our communities. We've seen a lot of cases of diabetes and so on and so on. It is not right. We should be able to access our traditional foods and locally grown foods as well. And our food should not be costing us an arm and a leg, in the sense that orange juice and fresh fruit and vegetables will almost be unviable because it costs so much. Where a box of highly processed food is much cheaper than the local food, the healthy food. That's just simply not right. And so when it comes back to negotiating with Indigenous peoples in our communities, we think that our communities should be able to say no. We need free, prior, and informed consent, and we need to be able to say no and have that respected.
Thank you. We can move on to Sierra.
I want to thank you for your question. My answer is going to be really short. And that is because, as someone who uses traditional medicines, I believe that we need to have proper consultation before we move forward or before we move ahead with these projects. It is super important that we have consultation, because for people that are living off of the land, if we lose those medicines, where do we go for them? So, there's so much more that I could say that would go on for more than 3 minutes, but I want to keep my answer very short and sweet. we need to have consultation.
As I said, I will give Kathy a moment, and then from there we can move on to another question.
Like Sierra, my response is very brief as well. As I said in my opening statement, Canada consistently fails to honor the Constitution. Our rights are enshrined in the Constitution. Canada continues to ignore that. We have to take them to court. Right now, they're in breach of court orders to bring Child and Family Services funding on reserves to be equitable with the rest of the country. So briefly, we need to pressure government to respect the laws of the land. As we saw with Jody Wilson-Raybould, when she called on the government to respect the law of the land, what did the federal government do? They ousted her. Now, I hope if I'm reelected, that if I stand up for something, they can't oust me, but they can oust Don Vandal, they can oust James Bidon, but they cannot oust me as an independent candidate. So I'm hoping any North Winnipeg people here, when it comes time to vote, that you will seriously consider voting for me as an independent candidate. But no, certainly, it's a given. Canada's breaking their own laws when it comes to Indigenous people. So if something has to be done, it has to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move on to another question.
Hello. Before I get to my question, I want to compliment her on her question. And I think that people living in Northern Ontario, living on a reserve where they should be able to hunt and fish, and somebody up the river has poisoned the whole area, I think that's horrible. And I think as soon as that was recognized, which is probably before most of us were born, that it was recognized that that lake, that Grassy Narrows, was a mess, then they either clean up the mess, and if you can't, if it's not possible at all, then find another similar place and move the community, because a community in Northern Ontario should have clean fish to eat and hunting. And if you can't, I don't want to belabor her point, but I just wanted to make that, I think that's more important than the one I was going to raise. Anyway, moving on. My question is that I attended the police board meeting last week, because they do have these meetings, and the Winnipeg police are very concerned with guns and gangs. Not really our issue, you'd think, except that there is a flow of handguns into our country that our good people at the border are not able to deal with. Somebody lands at the airport or drives across the border, they're inspected. They look in your trunk, they open up your suitcase, but if you walk across a field or walk across the road in Quebec, nobody checks your bags. There was a guy who lived in Toronto who snuck in with the refugees with a backpack full of handguns. And if we are having thousands of people with thousands of unchecked suitcases, and there's an incentive to bring guns in and sell them to gangs, that's something that should end. So I would like, for the protection of everybody downtown, because we're getting problems here, I would really like each of the candidates to explain how they're going to stop that flow of illicit guns into the country with people sneaking in.
Well, we need party candidates like, say a raise of hands who would like to answer that question. We have Dan and then
Thank
James.
you. Thank you so much. It's a great question, and that's a question we are taking very seriously. That's why I was so proud last April, or this April of 2019, when Minister Bill Blair was at the Manitoba Legislature, actually, to announce close to $200 million to go to cities across Canada to address guns and gangs. And in fact, I believe there was about 12 million that was coming to Manitoba, and the first slice, which was 1.3 million, came to the province of Manitoba, through the province of Manitoba to the city of Winnipeg for a Guns and Gangs initiative. And I'm proud to say that in late August, there was a significant arrest to get some guns off the street, as well as quite a bit of methamphetamine that was recovered. So what we need to do is work with the provincial government, work with the city government to make sure that a lot of these questions come down to the federal government can provide some of the money to work with city police, to work with Manitoba Justice, to get the guns and the gangs off of the streets. And we know that often these guns are coming cross-border. We've invested close to $80 million just in 2019 to work with the RCMP and Canada Border Services to increase the intelligence, the surveillance, to keep the guns out of our country. That's another initiative we're doing. So your answer in short, if I could summarize, I got 12 seconds, is work with the provincial government, Manitoba Justice, work with the City of Winnipeg City Police, and make sure they have the resources that they need to do the job that they need to do.
Thank you. James?
He seems like he wants to say something. I don't know.
Can I interject? That's after the guns have snuck into Winnipeg, you're helping WPS to find them and so on, but it's not stopping them at the border. 20 years ago, 5 years ago, they were stopped at the border because if you walked, you're in trouble. They need to be stopped before they come into the country, in my opinion. Not just fund the police.
Which is why we've invested over $100 million just in 2019 to stop the guns, to stop the guns and the gangs, to work with Canada Border Services, to work with the RCMP to keep the guns out of Canada. That's exactly what we funded in 2019.
Thank you. We will move on to James.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Thank you also for raising the plight of Grassy Narrows. I think that's important for people to hear about. Basically, we need to redirect resources, and you're right, we need to put direct resources at the border. Often we're putting a lot of public, and I see this as a lawyer, we're putting a lot of public prosecution resources into charging on gun charges for individuals that are more or less otherwise gun-abiding citizens. Beyond that, our party also supports a confidential handgun and assault gun buyback program. That's one way that we can get them out there that I think we need to deal with, and that's right in our platform that we just released today. I also just wanted to highlight also, one of the other things I think we need to do, particularly for our remote First Nations, is once again allow them to have security control at the airports. I mean, that's maybe an issue more for drugs than guns, but it still is an issue, and it goes back to the issue of self-determination and self-government, allowing our First Nations to have that security control to keep drugs and alcohol and other substances, be it guns, et cetera, out of their communities, because I know that has been an issue here in Manitoba. So thank you for your question.
Okay. I did not see anybody else raise their hands, so we will move on. Does anybody else have something to say?
Yeah, I actually want to call Dan on something because it was your leader's infamous Welcome to Canada tweet that created this problem. So now you guys are putting money into a problem that you guys already created, which is a waste of taxpayer dollars. And that's really frustrating to see. My husband works hard for his money. His tax...
I'm going to have to cut you off. I'm sorry. This is a town hall Q&A and not a debate. I'm sorry,
Oh, okay.
Sierra. Appreciate it, though.
Yeah.
And we will move on to the next question.
Hi, my name's Donna Henderson. I work for the First Nation Family Advocate Office with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And I've recently graduated from the University of Victoria Faculty of Law. And one of the issues that I'm having is that I have a significant amount of student debt. And I know that there's a myth going around that First Nation people have their school paid for free, which isn't true. I ended up having to take out a lot of student loans, and I have 2 children. And so I was thinking of ways that I could try and pay this off. And I was recently offered a job at Legal Aid. And so I wouldn't have a lot of extra income to help me with this. So I thought about getting a small business loan. And the federal government does offer a small business loan for First Nation people. up to $99,999. But there are several caveats, and so you have to be a First Nation person from Manitoba, which I'm not, and you have to have good credit. But I just recently graduated from law school, and I've been in school for 9.5 years, and my credit isn't very good. So this is the situation that I'm in, and I was wondering if any of you had any ideas about how to alleviate some of the stress for First Nation people who have recently graduated from university or are in the process of trying to go to school. And especially if you're a First Nation woman, a lot of us have children and we're raising them by ourselves, and it's all very stressful. So, thoughts?
I saw one hand. Any more hands? Okay, James, go ahead.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for your question. Congratulations on graduating from law school. It's a great question because, yeah, that's a good one. And thank you for also highlighting that, you know, there's a misconception out there. First thing to highlight is we need to remove the 2% cap on education funding that's been in place since the 1980s. Beyond that, though, Greens are in favor of actually forgiving student loan debt and making university and post-secondary education tuition free, as other countries have done. We see that as a way of expanding education as it's going that way. I'm familiar with the program because I have an on-reserve business that's 50-50 with my partner who is First Nation. And you're right, part of it's a grant, but part of it's a loan, so you'd have more debt at the end of the day, which is scary. And I'll put this out there, lawyers don't make as much money as the public sometimes thinks we do, especially those of us that want to do work like legal aid or do the heart work. But that's, in terms of our policy, that's what we'd like to do. And I mean, keep in there because it's a really unfortunate reality, but I see this. I see that we lose our young female and Indigenous lawyers at high numbers. I've seen a number in my work as a lawyer for the reasons that you explained, that we don't have a good work-life balance. So expanding a universal childcare plan that Greens are also in favor of, a guaranteed livable income, a universal pharmacare program. These are all other policies that we have that I think would have a huge impact on what you're struggling with. I don't know that I have time to get into them all, but please do, maybe afterwards. I'd love to just pick your brain a little bit and provide you with what limited wisdom I have as a lawyer that's have a few years ago. So thanks for that.
Thank you. We have a response from Dan.
Yes, first of all, congratulations for graduating, and I hope you stay in Manitoba and find work here. You're absolutely right. We need to do a better job. Our government in the last 4 years has improved the conditions and the terms and the length of repaying student debt, but it's not nearly enough. We need to do a better job. I will certainly take what you've said and bring it back to the policy people. I do know it's an issue of just basically making ends meet. And one thing we did do is we introduced the Canada Child Benefit for young families. So we're more generous with the amount of benefit that we give for young families. The less you make, the more generous the benefit is. It's not taxable, so if you get $200 a month for a child, you get to keep $200 a month for the child. It's made some improvement, but there's still a long ways to go, and that's one of the issues we want to keep working on in the next 4 years.
Thank you, Dan. I would like to take this moment to remind our Facebook viewers that you can join the conversation and ask a question. Do we have any more questions at the microphone? Yeah. Oh, one second. I'll ask to remind the party candidate leaders to raise your hand when the question's asked so that I know who to turn to after that, and as opposed to later. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to also congratulate you on finishing law school. That is a tremendous accomplishment as well, and it's nice to see that a vast growing number of Indigenous peoples are entering into very admirable and needed places of work. I know of myself, I had a part of my undergrad degree funded by my home community, but a part of it was not. And it was felt on my back for a very, very, very long time. In fact, it took me about 15 years to pay off my student loans, and I just finished it 2 years ago. And I know it really impacted a lot of decisions that I would have made over the years. And it was always I always just feel like I was a little something on my back. And so, absolutely, student loan can be very, very burdensome to a lot of people. And I know with the NDP, we want to immediately, if we were to form government, we want to immediately take student loan down to 0% of current and future student loans. Also, we want to transition from student loans to student grants. So that way, post-secondary education becomes much more accessible to all people.
Thank you. You may ask your secondary question, and we'll move on to the next question.
Okay, so this question is for Sierra. I grew up in Churchill, Manitoba, and my dad worked at the port. And so when it was sold to Omnitrax in 1997, they're an American company, and they let the Port of Churchill, as well as the tracks, fall into disrepair. And they haven't done anything to fix the port, although they did repair the tracks. And in 2011, the Conservative government disbanded the Canadian Wheat Board, and that's had a negative impact on the town because private companies don't want to send their grain to Churchill. For a little while, there was a subsidy for sending grain up to Churchill of $25 million, but when that ran out, private companies have just not been willing to send grain there. And so I'm concerned for the people who live there, and I was wondering what your plan was, or the Conservative government's plan was, to bring more business to Churchill.
That's a great question. Thank you. So I'm actually really happy to say that the port is up and running again. They actually just had their second ship come in to get filled with grain, which was amazing. I was actually up in Churchill July long weekend, and to see that big building not doing anything was really concerning. And to see the pain of the people who worked at the port not having work was also really concerning. So when they brought in that first grain ship, I was super, super excited. And now they've brought in a second one. I think it actually docked today or yesterday. There's a Facebook page where I had saw it, but the Conservatives are really committed to ensuring that Canadian grain is flowing through Canada, and I believe that Churchill is going to play a big part in that flow.
We will give Dan Vandal a minute to respond to that question. He raised his hand.
Yes, I'm glad you brought up the issue of the Port of Churchill, and you're absolutely right. Stephen Harper and the Conservatives dismantling the Canadian Wheat Board was a death knell to Churchill, and it's really interesting. I won't even get into that, but what I'm very glad. The point I wanted to make was that we've invested close to $120 million in Churchill to get the port up and running again. Some great work by Minister Jim Carr, as well as the First Nation leadership who actually own a stake in the future of the Port of Churchill, in the new consortium that's running the train company that actually goes up to Churchill. So I want to thank the First Nation leadership who really took the bull by the horns, worked in partnership with the federal government, true reconciliation, and actually contributed greatly to the reopening of the Port of Churchill.
Thank you, Dan. We'll move on to the next question. Thank you for being so patient.
Yes, very quickly. This is to Mr. Honorable MP Pandel. What happens if we accidentally bump heads with other countries when the Arctic melts?
Could you repeat the question, please?
If we bump heads with other countries when the Arctic melts in the Arctic and the Inuit people, and we all, because I get emails from various countries talking about how great that our Arctic is melting because, like Trump has already declared their Alaska Reserve, it's free for mining and stuff like that, which will affect their indigenous people, and also to James Bidon this is directed to, and also for the NDP, I'd like to know what he thinks of the Green New Deal. And I'm not good at asking questions.
So I just want to be clear. What happens when we bump heads with other countries
in the Arctic?
In the Arctic.
Yeah.
Well, it's the Arctic is part of Canada. It's important that
Do we use diplomacy?
The Arctic is part of Canada. The Inuit are actually governing the land, and First Nations in the western part of the Arctic. It's important, first of all, that we always respect the sovereignty and the self-government of the Indigenous people of the Arctic, working with the Canadian government to defend what is Indigenous and Canadian territory. So beyond that, it depends on the particulars of what your question is. I think it's important that, of course, we try to work with the United States on strategic geopolitical issues, and of course, that's more and more unpredictable lately. But it's important that we work with other countries to defend our national interests.
Thank you.
Bedham will speak next, and then Kyle will answer what he thinks about the Green New Deal.
So thank you for the question. I think it highlights the reality of climate change and that the Arctic is melting. So I think that's something that's important. And we have a detailed plan called Mission Possible, highlighting that it's not going to be easy, but we need to deal with climate change. With respect to your global security concerns, you're right. We need to approach diplomacy. We need to find ways to work with other countries. We need to basically, in a nutshell, work towards world peace. We need to make sure that's really our ultimate objective. So that's going to require open dialogue and a recognition. I think we need to be very careful about some of the strategic concerns, because I think it sort of has that resource extractive approach of the past that we need to leave with the 20th century and move towards the 21st century, which means a Green New Deal and means creating, protecting and restoring our relationship with the planet while also ensuring that there's good jobs for the future.
I want to thank you for your question. You were asking about some of the aspects of the NDP's environment and ideas. Well, the fact is, as we've been hearing tonight, the federal government, no matter which party it was, Liberals or Conservatives, have not been treating our country in a very healthy or sustainable way. And we're seeing that time and time again when it comes primarily in First Nations communities around the country, and particularly up north. The north is obviously seeing the effects a lot faster and more dramatically, and it just is not right. It is time that we have a dramatic change about how we treat our environment, and that impacts Indigenous rights and our sovereignty as well. I know that we are committed to keeping emissions to a temperature to 1.5 degrees. We also want to go to a zero emission economy, and we also want to end fossil fuel subsidies as well. And our plan will also create at least 300,000 green new jobs.
Thank you. We can move on to the next question.
Hi there. So we have 2 Facebook Live questions. So for those of you watching on Facebook, if you have a question, feel free to write in the comments and we'll read it out to you. So this first question is from a Facebook viewer, Nelson J. Giesbrecht. And his question is, would your party support Jordan's principle legislation introduced to the House of Commons? So I guess if your party just wants to speak to the position on Jordan's principle legislation. Anybody wants to speak to that? Okay. Go ahead, James had it first.
Sure. Absolutely, yes. It's required. I didn't have a chance to bring out Section 36 of the Constitution, so we often talk a lot about Section 35, which of course affirms and recognizes Indigenous rights, but beyond that, I think we need to look at Section 36, which talks about reasonably equitable services across this country. And it includes healthcare, it includes CFS, as some of my other panelists have brought up, it includes education, the interjurisdictional wrangling that results in First Nations being systematically underfunded in so many levels, including, of course, healthcare, including education, CFS, et cetera, absolutely needs to be repaired, and we need to repair that now without any delay, because, I think what we fail to recognize is it's costing us more. And I'm not just talking, yes, there's a budget line figure for it, but it's costing us in lives and in people and in impacts and continuing intergenerational trauma, and that's the real cost.
Thank you. Now we have Dan.
Yes, absolutely, yes. We support Jordan's principle. It includes everything that James mentioned, mental health, speech therapy, medical equipment. Since 2016, we've approved 341,000 requests for Jordan Principle at an estimated value of about $370 million. It's something that our country should have been doing many, many years prior. You can't, we're looking forward, so we absolutely support it, and we're gonna support it on a go-forward basis.
Thank you. Does the NDP and Conservative Party leaders have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I won't need 2 minutes. Absolutely, we support Jordan's principle. And we need to keep working on it. There's too many things and too many peoples that keep getting lost and kind of falling through the cracks. That's not right. We're talking about real lives and children's lives. And Jordan's principle needs to be strengthened, and we need to do what's right before we start worrying about who has to pay for it.
Sierra.
I fully support Jordan's principle.
We can move on to the next question.
So this is another Facebook Live question. This one is from Arlene Burrell. Her question is, do you support the young people that are fighting for a viable future? And her question is specifically in regards to, do you support fossil fuel expansions?
Question, James had his hand up. Any other party leaders? NDP?
No, we don't support fossil fuel expansions. That said, we do recognize in the transition, we'd like to make sure that we're utilizing Canadian oil during the transition. So that means not bringing in oil from Saudi Arabia and other places, and making sure that we're creating the jobs here in Canada. But no, we would stop the expansion. We would end subsidies to fossil fuel companies, which is something even the Stephen Harper government committed to in 2009 and Justin Trudeau committed to in 2015, but we still haven't seen the action on that. So it's an unequivocal hard no. We are the Green Party. We want to get us off fossil fuels as fast as possible. I'm going to suggest that only the Green Party of all the major parties has been steadfast on that position and has been pushing on that for decades. And I just also want to highlight, because I do very much appreciate the comments of independent candidate Ms. Dowd there, but Greens don't believe in whipped votes, so I also would have the independents to stand alone for my party. And when we did see MP Hire and Elizabeth May in Parliament, and now we have Manley and Elizabeth May, there are situations where they voted separately. So I just want to highlight that.
Thank you, James. Now we'll hear from Kyle.
And as I was saying earlier, we as the NDP, we want to move to a zero emission economy. Plus, we want to end fossil fuel subsidies. We want to make sure that we treat our environment and Mother Earth in a much better way. I often think about my son, who's 5 years old, and if we don't change rapidly and dramatically how we do things and how we have been doing things, the best science out there says that we have 11 years or less before we can see some really terrible things happen to our planet. And I want my son to be able to get his driver's license, and I want him to be able to graduate high school, and I want him to be able to have a family and a planet that is not on its way down to some climate crisis. I want him to grow up, and my future grandkids to grow up in a planet that is sustainable and is healthy, and that we are changing how we do things.
And now a response from the Liberal Party.
Yes, your first question was about young people and education. Could you?
It didn't mention education specifically. It said, do you support young people fighting for a viable future? And then the second part of the question read, do you support fossil fuel expansions?
Okay, I'll start with the first one. Absolutely, we do. I mean, that's the whole reason why I got into politics, is to try to make a difference and influence the lives of young people, because it's cliche, but young people are our future. And the way to a better future largely is through education. That's one of the reasons why our government has invested close to $300 million to build new schools on First Nation reserves in northern Manitoba, new schools in Bunnaby Cree Nation, God's Lake, Manitou-Sipi, and Wasagamik, as well as Lake St. Martin. just that assures that close to 2,000 young First Nation people will not have to leave their communities in order to go to school. And that's so important for their own education, for their families, for their community. And absolutely, we're going to do it. Prior to becoming a politician, I was a social worker. I worked with young people at risk. And when you're making an assessment of a young person, one of the most common elements that was amongst those young people, common amongst all of those young people, was that they didn't know their father. They grew up without a father in their life. And I think that's a challenge to all of us, to society, to make sure that we are better parents, we're better fathers to our young ones, because it's so important to get young people when they're young, like 0 to 5, to have that influence on them, because those lessons will live with them forever.
We have time to reset the clock to 1 minute so you could address the fossil fuels.
Pardon me?
She asked you about what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Fossil fuels, yes. I forgot about that one.
But you said absolutely yes. That's what I took that as, absolutely yes. Just kidding.
Okay, the question, fossil fuels, do we support?
The question was, do you support fossil fuel expansions? That's the wording of the question.
Listen, we recognize the economy and the environment go together. We recognize that we have a climate plan that reduces our reliance, that reduces greenhouse gas emissions over the long term. That's a complicated conversation. Over the long term, we're going to have to, of course, lessen our reliance on fossil fuels, but it needs to be done over a gradual basis so that the economy doesn't crater. So that's a complex. There's a lot of detail in there, but it's got to be. We believe that the economy and the environment go together, and that's where we're working.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, move on to the next question.
Hi there. So I've been paying attention to what's going on with this global change stuff, and well, for starters, the Earth's always been changing. We've gone in and out of ice ages and everything. I mean, there's no surprise there. The Greens and the Conservatives seem like they have a plan, whereas the Liberals just have a tax. So I think just giving more money to the Liberals so they can give it away to other countries or whatever is not a plan. It's just a tax, and it seems like a Liberal scam, if anything. So I'd like to hear what the Conservative and Greens' plans are.
Thank you. We'll start with the Conservatives.
So one of the first things that Andrew Scheer is committed to if we elect a Conservative government is completely getting rid of the carbon tax. Thank you for your question.
Now we'll go to the Greens.
Yeah, so we do have a plan. We have a 20-point plan referred to as Mission Possible. It does include putting a price on pollution. I mean, that's one of the ways in which we can create some incentives. But beyond that, we need to look at both actually further support for foreign aid. So one of the things in terms of the CETA funding that was cut, we also need to look at working with our municipalities, working with local First Nation governments so that we can implement needed projects. So we need a national transportation strategy, not just to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but also to keep, our women and our children safer. That's one of the recommendations of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry. So that's something that we have in our plan. I've already talked about, we will remove the subsidies for fossil fuels. It makes absolutely no sense that we're subsidizing some of the most profitable companies in the world. The fact that we're spending 10 to 13 billion on the Kinder Morgan expansion of taxpayers' funding makes absolutely no sense to me. That's money that we should be spending on the transition now. As I indicated in my opening, I'd like to see us building the pipelines to make sure that every First Nation has running water in this country, rather than building a pipeline to expand exporting bitumen overseas to China only to have it refined there and then brought back and resold to us. I think that makes no sense. So that's our strategy. I'd encourage you to go to our platform and read the full 20-point plan. I got 30 seconds left, so I'm not going to try to get into 1 point per second, but I'll leave it at that.
We have 1 minute so the Liberal Party can address that before we need to go to the next question.
Yes. I absolutely, I I refute the basis of your question. First of all, the climate is changing. I was the chair of the Aboriginal Peoples TV Network board, who had many board members from northern Canada, and you should speak to them who live on the land, who can tell you without equivocation that the climate is changing, the climate is warming. We have a plan that includes investing billions in clean, green technology. That includes taking microplastics out of much of our products, putting a ban on single-use plastics, banning coal by 2030, and many other things. You should check out our website, and you'll see that the price on pollution is only part of the plan.
I'd like to end on a humorous note. Somebody said to me, if we're not warming, we're cooling, and that would really solve the crime in Chicago, would be 3 miles of ice on top of it. Another ice age. Carbon is essential for life on this planet. Plants need it, we need it, we need it. We should stop bad-mouthing it.
Thank you. We have 2 more Facebook questions. I'll ask James. Where's James? Okay, we could give you 1 minute while the guy comes up to the mic.
When it
Give a woman.
comes to climate change and fossil fuel emissions, if I'm elected as an independent candidate, I'll certainly push for the elimination of pipelines and so forth, but it's not as easy as that, as Dan was saying. It's a complex process. It has to be done in a gradual way because us First Nations, we don't live in a capsule. We cannot just think about our own needs. I think what I would push for is healthy living in Winnipeg North, for example. I would push for a movement where we would gradually leave our cars at home and take bikes. I drive my bike all over. I have pleasure insurance on my car. So we can complain to government about pipelines, the Arctic melting, but as a population, we're just not interested in giving up our cars. Most people have 2 cars. I see rush hour traffic with 1 person in each car. Polluting the air, so.
Your time's, you have to wrap it up.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So
Thank you,
this
Catherine.
next question is from another Facebook Live viewer. This is a question in regards to the state of emergency that went out in God's Lake First Nation. So just generally, what would your party do to support, to address the suicide crisis in northern communities? It's a general question.
General question. Who's going to answer? James.
Wow.
We'll start with James.
That's a great question, and the first thing I want to say is, this isn't a new crisis, right? This is something that's been affecting communities across Canada. So, certainly I want to acknowledge that there's a crisis going on right now in God's Lake, but this is something that isn't new. I think it comes to expanding funding for mental health across the country, and particularly in First Nation communities. I think having a national strategy where we're dealing, as per the MMIWG report, where we're coming up with a strategy of how to deal with some of these issues is part of it. It's honestly, it's one of these sort of wicked complex problems, but one of the most important ones. I think a guaranteed livable income would have an impact on that to a certain extent, because we know that those that are living in poverty are 3 or 4 more times likely to experience a mental health concern. I commented a little bit about some of the security concerns for the communities to help deal with some of the addictions problems that come there. I can certainly say it's a legacy of the history of colonialism. I was able to see that in some of the work when I worked with a number of residential school survivors, right? And you can see that how this goes from one generation to the next. So it's not something that I think we're going to very easily be able to deal with. It's something where we have to make a concerted and a long-term effort towards true reconciliation. So it's a great question. I wish I could tell you that there's a quick, easy solution, but I think it's going to take us generations to repair, but we have to make sure we put the resources there. And also another important thing to recognize is make sure that there's economic opportunities and transportation for people in these communities too, because I think that also links into the suicide crises.
Thank you. We will have Dan next, and then Kyle. I didn't know if Sarah, and then Sierra.
Thank you so much. That's such an important question. Any suicide, the loss of an individual life, let alone several lives and dozens of lives for such a long time, is a tragedy beyond measure. And we are working very closely with the leadership of God's Lake. We've increased our community mental wellness teams to work with the leadership of God's Lake. It's a problem that's rooted in the colonialist history of our country, where when Canada was formed, the Indian policy at the time was Christianize, civilize, and then assimilate Indian people, take away their sense of who they were and language and culture. And it's a horrible situation. I think the solution lies in, of course, several things we have to do. Probably most important is that we have to work with the people who live there. The solutions have to come from within. We, as a government, need to be there to support the First Nations that are going through this horrible tragedy, and make sure that we're there to provide the supports that they need. But it's got to come from within largely, but we have to be there as well.
Now, I want to thank the individual who posted the question. It is, as you've been hearing, it is not it's not an easy, quick fix. It is not one or two things that we can do. Then, our suicide crises across the country would magically stop. It is correct to say that this is a long-term, intergenerational legacy of a colonial past towards Indigenous peoples, and it is an absolute tragedy because too many of our youth have gone and have left, and it is sad. As somebody who has had to attend too many funerals, I know it is absolutely heartbreaking to everybody in the community and their families, and it needs to stop now, and we need to make sure that we're doing what we can as fast as we can to make these things turn around. Plus, it is just it's not an easy thing, and we also need to listen to the chiefs and to the councils and to the elders to hear their wisdom into how to address these matters as well. We can't just go in assuming that we know the answer. We need to go and listen to the communities and to the community leaders.
So this is something that affects my riding that I'm running for federally, so I'm going to speak about this personally. I would really like to thank the person who asked that question for asking it. I've tried to actually talk about the issues that are happening up in God's Lake right now, and I get really emotional doing so. As someone who has struggled with depression, as someone who has struggled with suicidal thoughts, it breaks my heart that so many youth are feeling so hopeless in our northern communities. We need to do something, and part of the plan that I would like to see happen is having land-based healing camps for our youth to attend, where they can get back in touch with their culture and their teachings. This is something that personally that I would really like to see happen. The same thing with sobriety camps. We just finished our second camp in Black River, where people would go to do a land-based sobriety camp, and the success rate has been extremely high. So this is something that I would like to see happening in a lot of other communities. That is something that I will entirely fight for. My thoughts and my prayers go to the people in God's Lake, hurting so much from the tragedies that have happened this last year. And, you know, I think what I'm speaking on behalf of all of us when I say that we need to do better for our youth and our young Canadians in northern Manitoba and the rest of Canada.
So the last question is just to do the best that you can to paint a picture of what Canada would look like when the work of reconciliation is complete, and what would your party do to bring us there?
We will start with Sarah and make our way left.
Oh, that's going to be a long answer from me. So in my vision, reconciliation looks like we're not leaving people behind. It looks like clean water. It looks like better housing. It looks like more opportunities for our Indigenous youth, our Indigenous children. You know, reconciliation to me looks like thinking of the future of the children, the younger children. I've got 2 small children at home. I have an almost 3-year-old and a 7-month-old. And when I think about the future for them, I would like to see a future where they do not have to struggle. I find Indigenous children have more barriers to get over because of where we live, and you know, there's a lot of negativity out there towards us, and I like to see that completely go away. A Conservative government has, you know, stated that we would work our hardest to get all boiled water advisories and all do not consume advisories completely lifted. This is something that is going to take more than 4 years, but it is something that I am committed to fighting for personally. There's so much that we could do, and I don't think I could answer it in in the amount of time that we have, but for now, that's what I can think of off the top of my head.
Thank you. Can you restate the question?
Do your best to paint a picture of how Canada would look when the work of reconciliation is complete, and what would your party do to get us there?
I would agree that is a very long and complicated topic, and I don't think I can answer it within this time. But I honestly don't think that reconciliation will be complete, because it requires active, ongoing relationships between Canada and the Indigenous nations of this country. And like relationships of any sort need a continuous conversation, continuous coming together, continuous building an understanding and relationships. So I don't think that we can ever just say there's a checklist here and now we're done and forget about it. I think it will be an ongoing thing, as it should be with any healthy two-way respected relationship. How would Canada look in my opinion? Some of the things would be the fact that the education gap for our Indigenous children would be non-existent. There would be no boiled water advisories within the First Nations communities. Also, treaty rights and Métis rights and Inuit rights are being respected, and that it truly is a partner-to-partner, nation-to-nation relationship with the Crown. Also, the fact that I'd also say that UNDRIP would be a part of Canadian law, that we would be respecting that, and it's a sad thing to me that the Conservatives stall that in the Senate, because it is a minimum understanding, a minimum starting point of that of that mutual two-way equal relationship. Also, we could also be taking care of our environment, and our people wouldn't be on the front line of climate change. Also, our youth, whether it's in northern communities or within the urban communities, have hope for the future. They can see themselves in all aspects of society, and that they are working towards changing how we're perceived, and then they can also become full participants in Canada, along with people that are currently not youth.
Thank you.
So, wow, what an absolutely great question, and thank you for the person that posed that. I want to highlight that the report was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think the first thing that it's incumbent on the settler population to own up and face the truth, because I don't think that we fully faced the truth of our history. So until that's fully done, I think it's going to make it a challenge to move things forward. So I think that starts there. I think if I could paint a picture of a country where we're really reconciled, you could, similar to literally the ability to go in French or English. You could come across any government office across this country, and it would be, you'd have services in any, in all of the Indigenous languages of this land, and that, not just Indigenous people, but also our settler population would learn those languages, would have an experience to learn and to share in the knowledge that Indigenous people have and that have shared with us that, unfortunately, historically, the settler population hasn't always been good at listening or been good on actions. Then it comes down to achieving substantive equity in society, right? There's any number of statistics that we can look at comparing the Indigenous population with their settler population that shows that we're not on substantive equity, whether it's infant mortality rates, suicide, et cetera. So it comes with ensuring that we start to fix that, and that, I think, comes with supporting our First Nation governments, recognizing them as truly, giving them the recognition that they deserve as the original governments, as the original laws of this land. So we would have that recognition and that work going forward, and we'd have more land under First Nation control, because we still owe land under the treaties that we signed in 1870. It's absolutely absurd, and we would make sure that that was returned to First Nations people so that they could be managing that land base and they could be participating more. So that's kind of my vision, but wow, what a great question and how hard to answer. So that's the best I can do in 2 minutes.
Great answers, first of all, by all the members of the panel. How do you undo 150 years of colonization? Picture I would paint was that we would live in a country where First Nation custom, language, tradition, in all Indigenous nations is respected, and the ability to govern yourself, to be self-determining, is respected. A country where, in Manitoba here, where we don't have 12,000 kids in care, vast majority are First Nation and Métis, that would be an excellent start. A country where those social determinants of health, where the gaps are closed in education, the gaps are closed in health, the gaps are closed in, I've already mentioned child and family, but I'll mention it again. I think you've got to start when you're young. We've got to build healthier families where there's economic opportunity, where people have an opportunity, for First Nations people have an opportunity to go to school, get a good education, to get a job after they're finished school that's fulfilling. And that a country where we share the riches and First Nation culture and Métis and Inuit culture are respected and appreciated.
Wow, that was a great question. I'm sorry, everyone, that is our time for today for questions. I'd like to thank the party representatives for coming out, and let's give them a round of applause. Before we conclude the evening, we want to invite each person here to come to our I'm First Nation and I Vote event in Thompson, Manitoba on September 19th, this Thursday, at UCN at 7 p.m. The event will focus on the northern Manitoba riding of Churchill-Kawatanuk-Aski. Please join our Facebook group called I'm First Nation and I Vote to help promote these events. Invite your friends and family to attend so that the event is even louder and more powerful. To the party representatives, to show your appreciation for coming out today, I would like to present each of you with these gifts on behalf of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. Kathy, you want to come up and grab a gift? We got a gift as you. Let's give it up for Kathy, guys. That concludes our evening, everyone. Thank you again for taking the time to be here. This event will be posted on our YouTube channel and Facebook page. Please continue to share this video so that it will have an even stronger impact. Share your posts and photos on social media using the hashtag IFNAIV. I'm Ryan Beardy, and it was your pleasure to be your MC this evening. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy your evening. We will now have the drum group sing a song for us. Sue Arrow's drum group, everyone.